The room was silent, too silent. Only the faint scrape of a clay cup broke the stillness. A group of men stood in the shadows, their faces pale and trembling. And at the center of it all sat Socrates, calm as a stone, his eyes glowing with something that felt neither human nor divine, something in between. He lifted the cup of hemlock, the same poison used by Athens to silence its traitors. Yet there was no fear in his eyes, only a strange, knowing peace. Moments before his death, Socrates whispered something to his disciple Crito, a few simple words that would puzzle the world for over 2,000 years. Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt and do not neglect it. That was it. Those were his last words. But what did he mean? Why would a man, moments before death, speak of a sacrifice to a god of healing? The followers who watched him die, Plato, Crito, Apollodorus, were left speechless. Some thought he had gone mad from the poison. Others believed his words carried a message far deeper, one meant for the future. As the poison crept up his body, Socrates' breathing slowed, his legs turned heavy, and his eyes began to drift toward the ceiling. Yet, his expression never changed. Even as the shadow of death took him, he seemed free. To the men in that chamber, it felt like the world had stopped. The greatest mind of Athens, the man who had questioned kings, challenged gods, and stood against democracy itself, was gone. But what no one realized that day was that his final words held a hidden message, one that might not have been meant for Athens at all, but for us. It had all begun months earlier in the heart of Athens. The year was 399 BCE. The city that once ruled the seas was drowning in its own confusion. After the Peloponnesian War, Athens was broken, its empire lost, its spirit shattered, its people suspicious and afraid. And in this fragile city lived a man who questioned everything. Socrates, the stonemason turned philosopher, had made it his life's purpose to ask the questions no one dared to ask. What is virtue? What is truth? What is the good life? Simple questions. Yet, in a city built on pride and politics, they were dangerous ones. To the ruling class, Socrates was not just a nuisance. He was a threat, a man who exposed ignorance with reason and tore apart illusions with nothing but words. It was said that he had corrupted the youth, turned them against the traditions of the city. Among his students were Alcibiades, a reckless general who betrayed Athens, and Critias, one of the 30 tyrants who briefly ruled the city with blood and fear. And so, in a courtroom crowded with whispers and hatred, Socrates was put on trial. His crimes, impiety and corrupting the youth. The punishment, death by poison. When the jury announced the verdict, Socrates smiled. He could have begged for mercy, offered exile, or pleaded for life. He didn't. Instead, he said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Those words shook the room, because in them, Socrates revealed something terrifying. That truth mattered more than life itself. His friends tried to convince him to flee. Crito begged him to escape, offering bribes and a boat ready to sail at night. But Socrates refused. "Would I live by breaking the very laws I've taught others to honor?" he asked. "Better to die in obedience than to live in hypocrisy." And so he stayed. The day of the execution arrived. The sun burned low, and the air inside the Athenian prison was thick with sorrow. His students gathered for the final time. They spoke for hours about the soul, about immortality, about the meaning of death itself. These conversations, later recorded by Plato, would become the Phaedo, one of the most haunting dialogues in history. Socrates argued that death was not an end, but a beginning. That the soul, freed from the body, would finally see truth in its purest form. But if he truly believed death was freedom, why the strange last words? Why thank Asclepius, the god of healing, for a poison that kills? It was a paradox, and perhaps the final riddle he ever left behind. When the jailer entered with the cup of poison, he looked away, ashamed. Socrates took the cup, smiled gently, and said, "What do you say of this drink to the gods?" The man replied, "Only that you should pray it turns out well." Socrates nodded. "So be it." He drank it all, slowly, without fear. And then, the silence. His students began to weep. Only Apollodorus sobbed openly. But Socrates rebuked him softly. "Be quiet. Control yourselves." His voice faded as the poison numbed his feet, then his legs. "When it reaches my heart," he said, "I shall be gone." He lay down, covered himself with a thin cloth, and after a few moments, whispered to Crito, "We owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt and do not neglect it." Then he moved no more. The meaning of those words would haunt philosophers for centuries. Was Socrates thanking the god of healing for curing him from life? Or was it something even deeper, something that hinted at secret knowledge only he possessed? Some say it was a code, a message left for those who would come after him. A whisper to those who believed that truth was worth dying for. Because perhaps, just perhaps, the real disease was life itself, and death was the cure. The body of Socrates lay still on the prison bed. His friends had left in silence, their hearts crushed under the weight of his final words. Outside, the Athenian dawn was breaking, but to them, the world had lost its light. Only Plato remained, staring at the empty cup. He was young then, not yet the philosopher history would remember, just a student trembling before the death of his master. He kept hearing those last words echoing in his mind. "We owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt and do not neglect it." For decades, Plato would write, teach, and ponder, but never truly explain what his teacher meant. He left it in the Phaedo, preserved forever as a mystery. Was Socrates merely delirious? Or had he left a message meant to be decoded, a puzzle to test the minds of generations to come? To understand this, we must return to the Athenian belief system itself, a world where gods ruled every corner of life and death. Asclepius, the god to whom Socrates referred, was no ordinary deity. He was the god of healing, a figure who bridged the world of life and the afterlife. Temples of Asclepius were not just shrines. They were hospitals of the ancient world. Inside them, the sick would sleep, hoping for a vision from the god that would cure their illness. And the symbol of Asclepius? A staff wrapped by a serpent, the same image that modern medicine still uses today. But why would a dying man, condemned by his city, thank the god of healing? Some scholars say that Socrates believed death was the final cure, a release from the body's disease, a healing of the soul itself. To him, life was a fever of illusions, passions, and falsehoods. Death was clarity. So when he told Crito, "We owe a cock to Asclepius," he was offering thanks for being healed from the illness of existence. It was not despair. It was gratitude. Yet not everyone agrees. A darker interpretation suggests that Socrates was speaking in irony, mocking Athens, its gods, and its justice system in his final breath. After all, Athens had accused him of impiety, and now, in his last moment, he invokes a god's name. Was this submission or defiance? It would be the most subtle rebellion in history. Imagine it. The man condemned for disbelief, using his dying breath to make a pious offering. If so, his words were a blade wrapped in silk, a philosophical dagger aimed straight at the heart of his accusers. In the years that followed, Socrates' death became more than an event. It became a myth, a moment of transformation. Athens, once proud and powerful, began to question itself. The trial of Socrates was seen by many as a moral failure, a stain on the democracy it claimed to defend. Plato turned away from politics entirely. In the shadow of his teacher's death, he founded the Academy, the first true university in history. And there, he began building something that would last far longer than Athens itself: Western philosophy. Every idea Plato taught was haunted by the memory of that hemlock cup. He wrote of forms, of truth, of the soul's immortality, but between the lines, he was always writing about Socrates. His teacher had shown that the body can die, but the pursuit of truth cannot. But the mystery of the last words didn't end there. Centuries later, philosophers like Nietzsche would reopen the question. Nietzsche, the man who declared God is dead, read Socrates' final line with fascination and horror. He saw in it not gratitude, but surrender. To Nietzsche, Socrates was the first to poison Western thought with the idea that life is something to be cured, not celebrated. He called Socrates the first decadent, a man who turned away from the beauty of life toward a sterile idea of truth. In Nietzsche's eyes, Socrates' last words to Asclepius were a confession that he saw existence itself as a sickness. So who was right? Was Socrates a healer of the soul or a destroyer of life's joy? The truth may lie somewhere deeper, in the strange fusion of logic and mysticism that defined the ancient Greek mind. To the Greeks, philosophy and religion were not enemies. They were two sides of the same coin. Socrates might not have believed in the gods as myths described them, but he did believe in a higher order, a cosmic reason, which he called the daimonion, or inner voice. That voice guided him, warned him, even stopped him from fleeing his execution. He said it never told him what to do, only what not to do. And on that final morning, the voice was silent. To Socrates, that silence meant only one thing. It was time. When Crito asked if there was anything else to do before he died, Socrates said softly, "Nothing, except to remember that debt." But that debt, to whom was it really owed? To the God of healing? To truth itself? Or to the future? To every mind that would one day ask why? Because Socrates was not just thanking Asclepius. He was teaching one last lesson: that knowledge and death are not opposites, but partners. That to see truth, one must let go of the illusions of life. And that even in death, a man may smile, if he has lived without fear. But there's one more layer to this story, something even Plato never revealed, a secret that lay hidden not in philosophy, but in the ritual of the hemlock itself. Because the drink that killed Socrates may not have been what we think. The prison cell was still echoing with the memory of that final breath. But somewhere in the back of history, a quiet question began to whisper. Was Socrates' death really as simple as it seemed? The cup of hemlock, described in Plato's account, was no ordinary poison. It was a ritual, a ceremony performed according to Athenian law, clean, deliberate, and symbolically precise. But there are clues, buried in ancient texts, that hint at something far more mysterious. Something that suggests Socrates may have chosen his death not merely as obedience to law, but as a philosophical initiation. Let's start with the poison itself. Hemlock, Conium maculatum, is a powerful neurotoxin that slowly numbs the body while leaving the mind fully conscious. The victim remains aware, feeling the creeping paralysis from the feet upward until the heart stops. To the Greeks, this was not just execution, it was purification. They believed the soul could only be free once it was separated from the body, without violence or chaos. The poison, in their eyes, was a sacred medicine, not a punishment. And that word, medicine, leads us back to Socrates' strange choice of words. We owe a cock to Asclepius. In ancient Greece, a rooster was sacrificed to Asclepius after a person recovered from illness. It was a gesture of gratitude for healing. So when Socrates spoke those words, it was as though he were saying, "I have been healed. My soul is cured. I am free." It was not irony. It was initiation. A transformation from mortal to immortal, from philosopher to symbol. But some ancient rumors tell a darker tale. whispers that the poison may not have been given by the guards alone, that one of Socrates' students may have had a hand in preparing it. Among his followers, none were more devoted or more ambitious than Plato. Later stories, passed down by commentators like Diogenes Laertius, claim that Plato was ill and absent that day. Yet others speculated he was very much there, and that what he saw was too sacred to describe in detail. Could it be that Plato omitted parts of the scene from the Phaedo, that Socrates' death involved a secret ritual known only to the initiated? After all, Socrates was deeply influenced by the Orphic and Pythagorean teachings, mystical sects that believed the soul was imprisoned in the body, awaiting release through wisdom and purity. In those traditions, death by poison, calm, conscious, controlled, symbolized the final purification of the philosopher. The body dies, but the soul awakens. And when Socrates smiled as the numbness crept up his body, perhaps it wasn't defiance. Perhaps it was recognition. He was walking the final step of the path he had followed all his life, the path toward truth beyond illusion. When Plato later wrote the Phaedo, he described Socrates' final moments not as a tragedy, but as a victory. The scene is quiet, almost sacred. No cries of pain, no fear, only acceptance, discussion, and peace. Plato's choice of words is deliberate. He calls death the separation of the soul from the body, as if Socrates were performing a divine act rather than suffering in execution. It's almost as if the story was meant to initiate the reader to make them feel the calm, to face the idea of death without terror. And in this way, Socrates' final lesson reached beyond philosophy. It became spiritual rebellion. He turned his own death into an act of teaching. The city of Athens wanted to silence him, but he turned their punishment into a final lecture on freedom. As the centuries passed, those last words continued to haunt thinkers from every age. Early Christians saw Socrates as a pagan prophet, a man who died for truth as Christ would later die for faith. Renaissance scholars viewed him as a martyr for reason, slain by ignorance. And modern philosophers, from Kierkegaard to Heidegger, saw in his silence the eternal question, what is it that we owe the world before we die? Perhaps that was the real meaning behind the debt to Asclepius. Not a literal offering, but a symbolic one. A reminder that each of us owes a gesture of thanks for the healing power of truth. Socrates lived his life curing others of falsehoods, ignorance, and moral blindness. In his final moment, he became the patient, healed of his own human limitations. But one mystery still lingers. Why did he whisper the message only to Crito? Why not to the others? Some historians believe he trusted Crito with something unspoken, a ritual obligation to carry out after his death. Not just the sacrifice, but perhaps a continuation of his teaching, or even the foundation of something secret, a circle of followers who would protect his philosophy from the corruption of Athens. This idea gave birth to a legend, that after Socrates' death, a hidden order of his students met in secret to discuss his doctrines, calling themselves the healers of the soul. Though no record of them survives, fragments from later philosophers mention groups in Megara and Thebes who followed the silent teachings of Socrates. If true, then his final words were not only symbolic, they were instruction, a command to keep healing, to keep questioning, to never let truth die. As Athens carried on, the man they executed grew larger than the city itself. He became a mirror through which every generation saw its own struggle between truth and power, faith and reason, fear and freedom. And maybe that's what Socrates foresaw when he smiled and lifted that cup. He knew he was not dying. He was transforming. The body would vanish. The mind would scatter. But the question would remain, what if death is not the end, but the cure?